Each day, your job requires you to clean and sanitize equipment and environmental surfaces. Using cleaning chemicals is a necessary part of that job. When used properly, these sanitation chemicals help make food products safer to eat and drink. But without proper handling, any chemical can be dangerous. It can harm people or the environment. Exposure to chemicals can result in physical and health hazards. Physical hazards might include flammability or hazardous vapors. Health hazards can be short-term problems like skin irritation, or they can be long-term problems like burns or blindness. To protect workers and the environment from chemical hazards, country and local regulations are in place to protect you and the people you work with. Many nations have adopted the United Nations Globally Harmonized System, or GHS. This is a system for standardizing and harmonizing the classification and labeling of chemicals. GHS mandates a standard format for information on every hazardous chemical, and it's a worldwide standard for the countries that choose to use it. This consistency of information allows for improved handling, use, and storage of all hazardous chemicals for you, your coworkers, and your company. All regulatory agencies that govern the processing of food in some way must address the need for safe and proper use of chemicals. Employers must take steps to protect employees. 5 ways to accomplish this are: employee information and training. Your employer will tell you about the hazardous chemicals used in your workplace and train you to work with them safely. Knowledge is the best defense against the hazards you face in your job. A written program. Your employer will develop a written program and make it available to you. The written program explains your employer's hazard communication plan. It details how the hazards and risks of using chemicals in your workplace are communicated to you. A chemical inventory. Your employer will maintain a list of all hazardous chemicals used or stored in your workplace. The list might be written on paper or stored in a computer, but it must be available to employees and should be kept current. Safety data sheets, or SDSs. Your employer must have an SDS for each hazardous chemical used in your workplace. It describes the chemical, its hazards, and how to safely use, handle, and store the chemical. SDSs must be kept up to date and in a place where workers on all shifts can easily find them. And labeling. Your employer will see that all chemical containers are properly labeled. The labels must clearly identify the chemical, and they must provide information similar to the SDS, but not as detailed. So far, you've learned about some of the requirements of the Chemical Safety Program and GHS. Now we will look at 2 of these requirements in more detail: safety data sheets and labels. With this information, you'll be able to make the right choices about safety. Before handling a hazardous chemical, you need answers to many questions. For instance, what are the health and physical hazards? What personal protective equipment, or PPE, do you need? What precautions should you take? What first aid procedures should you follow? You can find the answers to all of these questions and more on a Safety Data Sheet, or SDS. Your employer must have an SDS for each hazardous chemical used in your workplace. The information comes from the chemicals manufacturer or importer. Because of GHS, all SDSs will be broken down into the same sections, no matter what the chemical is. Here's an example of an Ecolab SDS. The sheet has different sections that present important safety information about the product. The first is product and company identification. It gives the name of the chemical and tells what it's used for. It also provides the supplier's details, including name, address, and phone number, and an emergency phone number. Section 2 identifies the hazards posed by the chemical, along with the information that's required to be on the chemical's label, including the pictograms, signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements. The next section describes the composition of the chemical. It lists the ingredients that have been used to create the chemical and which of those are known to be hazardous. First aid measures are outlined in the next section. They describe important symptoms and effects of exposure to the chemical, as well as the required treatment you should use to help yourself or someone else who has been exposed to the chemical. Section 5 describes the combustibility of the chemical and how to put out a fire involving this chemical. The next section describes any special cleanup procedures in the event of a spill. Section 7 outlines the safe ways to work with and store the chemical. The next section shows the minimum amount of time you could be exposed to the chemical before being potentially affected, and how to protect yourself through proper clothing and handling techniques. The next section will describe the physical and chemical properties of the chemical, such as its appearance, odor, flammability, and explosive limits. Section 10 describes how stable the chemical is, as well as the conditions that create instability, such as mixing chlorines and acids. This section identifies the degree to which the chemical is poisonous, as well as other potential health hazards. It lists both acute and chronic health conditions that can result from overexposure to the chemical. Sections 12 through 15 provide additional information about the chemical's environmental impact, proper disposal practices, how to safely transport the chemical, and specific regulations that apply. Finally, the last section provides additional information about the chemical, including the date when the SDS was prepared or last revised. An SDS is a storehouse of valuable safety information. It's your employer's responsibility to keep these sheets updated and available. It's your responsibility to know where to find them and how to read them. If you need help, notify your supervisor immediately. The quickest and easiest way to get information about the chemicals you use on the job is to read the label, something you should do before you begin work with any chemical. Labels usually contain the same kind of information you find on an SDS, but less detailed. By reading an Ecolab label, for example, you can find out such things as the type of chemical you're working with and what PPE to use. There are 6 label elements required by GHS: the product identifier or ingredient disclosure, signal word, hazard statement, pictograms, precautionary statement, and supplier identification. We will take a closer look at each element so that you are familiar with the information you can find on the label. The product identifier describes just that: the name of the chemical or a brand name, or the hazardous ingredients the chemical contains, or both. The signal word discloses the relative level of hazard severity. Danger is used for more severe hazards, and warning is used for less severe hazards. The hazard statement describes the type, nature, and degree of the hazards associated with the chemical. Pictograms are used to depict all the physical, health, or environmental hazards caused by a particular chemical. All of the hazards that apply to that specific chemical are shown. The pictogram is always a black symbol shown on a white background and surrounded by a red diamond-shaped border. There are 9 different pictograms. Ask your supervisor if you have any questions about what these pictograms mean. The precautionary statement describes actions that should be taken to keep yourself and others safe while using or storing the chemical. This could include what types of PPE are required to safely use the chemical. Finally, supplier identification includes the name and contact information of the supplier, manufacturer, or importer of the product. Color can also convey information. For example, With Ecolab labels, alkaline cleaners have green color coating on the labels, and acid products have dark pink or red. These colors correspond to the Ecolab Emergency Chart, a tool that provides first aid, PPE, and other necessary product information. Containers of chemicals that enter your workplace have labels supplied by the manufacturer or importer. However, if you fill any small containers of chemicals from larger ones, you are responsible for labeling them. Ecolab bulk product storage and labeling have additional requirements and training. Your supervisor can answer any questions you may have about these. Your employer is responsible for having the chemical containers in your workplace labeled. You're responsible for immediately notifying your supervisor whenever you find labels that are unreadable or missing. Keep in mind that an unlabeled chemical is always hazardous. So far in this video, we've focused on what your employer does to help ensure your safety. Now we'll look at things you must do for the safety of yourself and others when working with hazardous chemicals. Remember, if at any point you feel uncertain about a procedure, be sure to ask your supervisor. Let's look at ways to avoid hazards. First, always remember to wash and sanitize your hands thoroughly before starting work and after breaks. Remove all jewelry. This is not only a good manufacturing practice, but also a safe work practice. Just as it traps bacteria, jewelry traps chemicals that can irritate your skin. Jewelry can also get caught in machinery, posing another type of hazard. Wear the proper PPE, face and eye protection, chemical-resistant apron, chemical-resistant gloves, whatever is required to protect yourself. And be sure to wear it correctly. Finally, cuff your chemical-resistant gloves and wear your sleeves outside the gloves. Similarly, wear pant legs outside your boots. That way, if a chemical spills, it won't run into your gloves or boots and burn you. If you have any questions pertaining to the proper PPE, please consult the SDS, product label, or your supervisor. Now here are some things to avoid. Never eat, drink, smoke, or apply cosmetics near hazardous chemicals. Never use a drinking glass or cup to measure or carry chemicals. Never pour chemicals above your head. It's too easy to spill. Never add water to a caustic or strong corrosive. Always add the chemical to water. That way, if the mixture splashes, you'll be less likely to get burned. Never mix chemicals unless directed to do so. You might produce a harmful reaction. If you are instructed to mix chemicals, use the proper PPE and follow these tips. Always add chemicals to a clean, closed container. Never carry chemical products in an open pail. Dissolve caustics and alkalis in cool water, never hot water. Stand back and pour them in slowly. That way you'll avoid burns. Keep acids and chlorinated products apart. Your cleaning schedule should never allow these two chemicals to mix in a common drain. Finally, never point a high-pressure rinse hose at anyone. The water pressure in this hose is so high it can damage an eye or even cut off a finger. It's as dangerous as a loaded gun. Despite all these precautions, accidents can still happen any time you're working with hazardous chemicals, so be prepared. Know basic first aid. Know where the eye wash stations and emergency showers are located. Know company procedures for handling spills or leaks and for responding to injuries. And know your company's evacuation procedures. When an emergency does occur, you need to act quickly. Remember to do these things. Ask a coworker to call for help immediately. Stop an injured person who's running. Physically restrain the person if you must. Evaluate the situation. Depending on the type of injury, you may have to remove contaminated clothing. And you may need to flush eyes or skin with cool water, holding the injured person's eyes open if necessary. If the injured person needs treatment, give the product label or SDS to medical personnel. You need to be informed about the chemicals you work with, their hazards, and the steps your employer takes to keep you and your coworkers safe. You also have a responsibility to know what steps you must take to protect yourself and others. With this information, you can be confident that you are making the right choices about safety.